I hope everybody can hear me. Can you raise your hands if you see me and hear me? Perfect. Well,
Hi.
look at, hi. So I'm doing double duty today. We are going to be, this is not a fake backdrop for me. This is a real backdrop. I'm at the Delray Beach Playhouse, and I am with Randy DelLago. And this is his first time Zooming. Okay, so that's why I'm here to, and everybody's going to make him feel comfortable. And I have my computer. I'm right next to him. We're social distancing, and this is going to be a fun treat. So one of our members, Mrs. Lois Schiff, introduced me to the notion of speaking with Mr. Delgado, and I am so happy that she suggested that I meet him and get him to lecture. He does several lectures, and this was one of them that I thought would be totally fascinating on this evening. So I know that some of us might have to leave early, but don't worry, we are recording this and we will put this on our YouTube channel. All right, so you've heard enough from me. I am going to bring on Mr. DelLago. Thanks, everybody.
Hello, hello, hello. How are you? This is my first appearance on Zoom. I should have asked if that comprehended the same size screen that Cinerama did, since I'm a fairly large fellow. What is this? Is that it? Okay. But anyway, Tammy introduced this as a lecture. I retreat from the word lecture because that sounds like it's going to be deadly boring, and I hope it's not. I've been doing programs all my life. Literally, when I was 19 years old, I volunteered to do a program at my public library in Wilmington, North Carolina, on a poet that I discovered and realized that nobody else was reading. And since then, I've been doing programs on writers that I adore. I have learned through my life that so many people, after they leave school and they've done the obligatory reading that they had to do for school, never return to those writers. They think of them as schoolwork or homework. Whereas, of course, we study them because they're wonderful writers to begin with. And if you kind of put that distance between you and school and realize that Mark Twain was a wonderful, wonderful writer and certainly wrote, I believe, the single funniest novel in the history of American literature, Innocents Abroad, a screamingly funny book. And I think also the most single important book in American literature, Huckleberry Finn, which some people still insist upon thinking of as a children's book. It is certainly not. Many people have only read it in school editions, in which case it was heavily, heavily truncated and probably did not give them a sense of the full breadth of the novel. So if I can do anything tonight to encourage you to go out and get Huckleberry Finn and reread it, I will have done good work tonight then. Otherwise, I'm just going to give you an hour's talk, a little program on the relationship between Mark Twain and his wife, Olivia. Mark Twain was an incendiary writer. He was not a man who would have been very, what the English would call, clubbable. He did not agree with most of the people of his time. He was a firm believer in civil rights at a time when there was no such thing. It was before the concept. He was not religious in a very religious age, of course, but he was brilliant. So I hope you enjoy this program. After this talk about him and his wife, Olivia, if there's time for a little encore piece, I will give you a speech that I particularly am fond of, having just turned 70 myself. There happens to be a speech that we have from his 70th birthday when he was celebrated. He gave a short speech, and at the end of the program, I'll give you a version of it if you can hang in that long. Well, every short list of great American writers, of course, will include one name, whether the list is headed by Herman Melville or whether it's William Faulkner or anyone else. Somewhere near the top of that list is going to be Mark Twain. Of course, the moment you begin to add names to this particular literary group, whether it's Edgar Allan Poe or F. Scott Fitzgerald, whatever your taste, even Ernest Hemingway himself, who would be included in that group, was a great fan of Mark Twain's. In fact, he said that all American literature began with Huckleberry Finn, and I think he was very much correct. General readers who know Twain only as the handful of juvenile classics like Tom Sawyer or A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court would be absolutely amazed, I think, to realize some of the other more serious works that he wrote. Most of us think of Mark Twain today, if you're old enough, over 50 or 60, you probably remember Hal Holbrook, the wonderful actor who portrayed Mark Twain on stage for, I think, almost 50 years. And happily, there is a film of his performance that PBS did many years ago. So you can actually kind of find that out. I don't know if you can stream it. I haven't started streaming yet, so I don't know. But he was our own Voltaire and George Bernard Shaw rolled into one. There is a darker side to Mark Twain, and it would surprise, I think, many of his more conservative readers. For example, in an age of real, almost militant religiosity, he proclaimed that Christianity was the single greatest source of evil and intolerance ever inflicted upon the Western world. You can imagine how that would have repercussions in certain circles. Politically, there was never a time when he did not prefer what he would call revolution to complacency. And as a lifelong observer of mankind and its institutions, Twain eventually came to believe that the greatest blight ever visited upon the earth was what he, without any kind of humor or exaggeration, simply referred to as that damned human race. Well, understanding these elements in Twain's personality, suddenly many of his very famous aphorisms, which we usually simply smile at, suddenly take on a darker meaning and might make a couple of people wince. For example, Mark Twain once observed, it could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctive native American criminal class except Congress. One of Twain's aphorisms that every successful politician understands goes like this. He says, let us be thankful for fools, but for them, the rest of us would not succeed. And here's an observation that reveals Twain's profound understanding of the human psyche. He said, let me make the superstitions of a nation, and I don't care who makes its laws. Well, looking back at the build up to the Iraq War, for example, it's obvious that someone in the White House remembered this word of advice from Mark Twain. He said, the old saw says, let sleeping dogs lie. But if you have enough influence, you can usually have a newspaper do it for you. And certainly one of the most prescient observations that Twain ever made, as pertinent today as the day he made it, was, in the first place, God made idiots. This was for practice. Then he made school boards. Think about it. Well, in his writings, Twain tried his best to conceal his contempt for religion, but in conversation, he occasionally would blurt out what he really believed. Faith, he once said, is believing what you know isn't so. He also made this suggestion. He said, let us endeavor so to live that when we finally die, even the undertaker will be sorry. Well, contemplating a history rich in examples of man's inhumanity to man, he observed that man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. And speaking to the Young People's Society at Greenpoint Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn one day, he said, given the opportunity, always do the right thing. It will gratify some people and it will astonish the rest. Or reading these observations today, Mark Twain's cynicism seems almost congenial, and yet it's astonishing to think that as a writer with such a jaundiced view of the world, that he should have been as popular as he was during the Victorian era. In fact, he was the most popular author of his era. He was our Charles Dickens, if you like. Clearly, it was helpful that his medium was humor. As George Bernard Shaw once said about his own work, I can say with humor what I would be hanged for saying seriously. But for Twain, finding the right medium for his message was not enough. Even a popular humorist can sometimes go too far and offend the very audience that he's appealing to. Twain, like any other outspoken personality, needed from time to time an editor, someone to act as a sounding board for his public, someone who actually shared the views of the Victorian sensibilities of his readers, which he obviously did not. Victorians, after all, not only believed in the perfectibility of mankind, they believed that they had achieved it, whereas Twain simply saw man as the most self deluded of the apes. Well, the editor he eventually found, and the woman who became the editor not only of his work and his life, was, of course, his wife, Olivia Langdon Clemens. And it's safe to say that much of Mark Twain's popularity, even as it exists today, uh, is owed in large part to her, his posthumous reputation, as well as his reputation during his own life. It was the result of her love and her labors. And it could not have been a very easy matter to tame Mark Twain. Olivia was born in 1845 to a family that had earned its wealth and prominence in the lumber business. Her ancestors included one Langdon, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress during the American Revolution, and who later became a governor of New Hampshire, and another who served as the president of Harvard University, very high up. Both her father and her mother were committed abolitionists. Prominent figures in the fight against slavery were frequent guests in their home, including the former slave and the pamphleteer Frederick Douglass. In fact, when the Langdon home was torn down in 1939, excavations discovered a series of tunnels connecting one house to a nearby church. Clearly, their home had been part of the Underground Railroad that helped slaves escape from the South to the North. Olivia's father helped to finance the abolitionist activities of Thomas K. Beecher, who was the half brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who gave us, of course, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Libby's Sunday school teacher was Beecher's wife, Julia Ward Beecher, who supplemented her class's Bible readings with lengthy passages from works by authors like Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson, two of her favorite contemporary writers. Well, the influence of Julia Ward Beecher, along with her family's custom of reading aloud to each other in the evenings, instilled in Livy a lifelong passion for reading and a passion for discussing what she had read. Remember, this was long before the era of people communicating with the little devices in their hands. People had to get together and actually discuss a book or do it through their writing. Throughout her life, her correspondence between herself and her family and her friends was always punctuated with comments either about what they had recently read or what they were currently reading at the moment. Her own letters, both to her family and friends, invariably closed with the line, "What are you reading? Write and tell me all about it." Well, unfortunately, while the preparatory schools for girls at that time, although they taught a great deal of history and mathematics and Greek and Latin, their primary goal was not to prepare women for professional or scholarly careers, but rather to be wives and mothers. Women were expected to be educated just well enough to engage in dinner conversation and to tutor their children, but they were not expected to play any significant role outside of the home. A pamphlet advertising the Elmira Ladies Seminary in 1853 announced that the school's chief goal was to imbue young girls with that genuine courtesy which flows from a desire to render others happy. Well, this desire, stemming from a woman's natural inclination to esteem others better than themselves, of course, was expected of women. But of course, I doubt if you'd find a line like that in any book prepared for young men of the time. Like so many other young women of her generation who were well educated and intellectually curious, she was, of course, very frustrated at the very limited daily routine expected of household duties and chores that constituted women's work at that time. Physically undemanding, but psychologically exhausting, the unnaturally constricted lives of 19th century women of the upper classes eventually gave rise to a medical phenomenon, a virtual epidemic of elusive nervous disorders characterized by headaches and depression, partial or complete paralysis, anorexia, lethargy, insomnia became rampant. These disorders were usually called nervous prostration or hysteria, or the most popular term, most fashionable term, I should say, was neurasthenia. Now, those common explanations for this suggested that women were undergoing too much mental strain. A popular physician of the time once said this. I love his phrasing. He says, "The fast ways of the American people today, with their hurried lives, late hours, and varied excesses, wear upon the nervous system of all, but especially upon those of women." That was written in 1852. Sounds like he's describing a corner of New York City today. He continued, "Growing girls are proverbially weak and sensitive." And he pointed out that because of this, mental application, close and long continued, often results in invalidism. He really believed that thinking and reading, for example, were simply overstraining young women's minds too much, and that they might actually damage their bodies by too much reading and too much thinking. Needless to say, such nervous disorders were never very troublesome among the poor or blacks or hardworking immigrant women. Women of the lower classes didn't have the luxury of being neurasthenic. After all, it took money and a particular social status to be delicate and, of course, completely idle. Well, by the 1860s, invalidism had become institutionalized along with a kind of a cult among the wealthy, which included, of course, Olivia and her family. It was very fashionable to take very expensive cures for this disease. And of course, there were regimens. Cures included, for example, complex varieties of diet, rest, massage, and even electrical treatments at the time. But the standard response for this disease was a rest cure developed by a Dr. Silas Mitchell. His cure for women who were having this particular problem consisted of isolating the patient in bed for a minimum of 6 weeks, during which time she was visited only by her doctor and her nurse to feed and massage her. There was to be nourishing food and complete absence of any kind of mental excitement, which meant that she wasn't allowed to read. Can you imagine lying in bed for 6 weeks and not being able to read? The purpose, of course, is to build up her system, give her strength. Well, needless to say, with any treatment of this nature, with no physical exercise, muscles kept completely inert to the point of atrophy, plus a high-fat, high-caloric diet, it's unlikely that any patient ever completely recovered very quickly. I'm sure that many never recovered at all. As a result of a fall on the ice when she was a day student at Elmira, Livy became bedridden, and as a result of a long confinement, she was diagnosed with neurasthenia at the age of 16, and her recovery took a total of 4 years. It was 2 years before she was even allowed to walk again by herself, and 2 more years before she was deemed strong enough to travel. Now, by the time she was 22 years old, Olivia Langdon's life seemed quite settled, with her sister Sue already married and her brother Charles destined to take over their father's business in the lumber trade. Livy would be the dutiful daughter who would stay home and take care of her parents. Fortunately, before assuming his place in the family's lumber business, her brother Charles was given a trip to Europe. It was the grand tour that the wealthy took in those days. And on a steamer called the Quaker City, he met a 30-year-old journalist and travel writer who was named Samuel Clemens, although he wrote under the professional name of Mark Twain. It was in Charlie's stateroom while the Quaker City was docked in the Bay of Smyrna that Clemens first saw an ivory miniature of Charlie's sister Olivia. For the rest of his life, Mark Twain claimed that he literally fell in love with his future wife when he glimpsed her face in that engraving. They met for the first time at a reunion of the Quaker City passengers in New York. That was in December of 1867. And 4 days later, on New Year's Eve, Mark Twain joined the party because they were going to attend a public reading given by Livy's favorite author, the English novelist Charles Dickens, was in New York and was speaking. Of course, he was wildly popular over here. Well, at the time they met, Libby was not entertaining any ideas of marriage at all, but Twain was already determined that he would marry her as soon as he was financially secure. His financial situation was important to him because, as he said, he wanted to be able to provide for his future wife the kind of life that she could enjoy as a companion to him. He didn't want her simply to be a housekeeper and to cook and keep the house for him. As he wrote to a friend, if I were settled, I would quit all nonsense and swindle some poor girl into marrying me today. But I wouldn't expect to be worthy of her because I wouldn't have a girl that I was worthy of. She wouldn't be respectable enough. Well, at the time, of course, there probably weren't many people who would have disagreed with him. Mark Twain had made his career representing the untutored Westerner who always found himself at odds with the very cultured society of the East. Even his dispatches from abroad were written in the guise of a kind of a spiritual ruffian who neither understood nor could appreciate the finer accomplishments of Western civilization. Unlike the great majority of American writers who returned from Europe, for example, extolling its culture and its expanse of art at the expense of America, Mark Twain's perspective was quite different. For him, Europe was stale, he said. And to employ one of his favorite expressions, it was all used up. While America, according to Mark Twain, provided an entire continent of untapped resources and possibilities. Mark Twain was the first American writer to compare his own country with Europe's countries and not find his own country lacking. With culture, as with life itself, Mark Twain saw very little advantage in being dead. For example, most Americans tended to be either overwhelmed by or at least dutifully impressed by their first visit to Bayreuth to hear the operas of Richard Wagner. Well, here is Mark Twain's account of his first visit to Bayreuth to hear a Wagnerian opera. He said, although I had been raised in the most exclusive circles of Missouri, I had never attended the Wagnerian opera. So in Germany, I went to Bayreuth and took in Parsifal, and I shall never forget it. The first act alone occupied 2 full hours, and I must say, I enjoyed it in spite of the singing. Though singing does seem to be the wrong name to apply to it. In Parsifal, there is a character by the name of Gurnemanz, a hermit, who stands on the stage in one spot, practicing by the hour, while first one character and then another endures what he can of it and then retires from the stage to die. Well, I found that there is nothing the Germans love so much as opera. They like it wholeheartedly as a result of habit and education. Our nation will like it too by and by, no doubt. At least 1 in 50 of those who attend operas today actually enjoy it. Well, some of those Wagnerian operas bang along for 6 whole hours at a stretch. I remember the one called Lohengrin. The banging and the crashing was something to behold. It was beyond belief. There wasn't much acting, that is to say, there wasn't much done. It was only really talked about, and always violently. Nor was there much of that customary thing where the tenor and the soprano stand down by the footlights and warble in blended voices. No, in this piece, it was every rioter for himself and no blending. Each one sang out his grievance in turn, accompanied by the whole orchestra of 60 instruments. And just when one was hoping they might come to some sort of understanding and to modify the noise, a great chorus composed entirely of maniacs would suddenly break forth. And during the next few minutes, I lived all over everything I had suffered on the night that the orphan asylum burned down. But much as his readers may have enjoyed Twain's uniquely Western perspective on art and culture, Twain in the flesh was enough to throw even the most informal Eastern dinner party into confusion. To begin with, he carefully cultivated every eccentric mannerism he could think of that might set himself apart, distinguish him from Eastern literary social circles. He deliberately drawled when he spoke. He shuffled his feet when he walked to give himself a kind of a lazy appearance. He generally wore sealskin hats and coats along with gray jackets and purple ties. When the socialite Lillian Aldrich first met him at a formal dinner, she simply assumed that he was drunk. On other occasions, he would arrive at a dinner party wearing white bedroom slippers along with evening clothes. He later proceeded to entertain her astonished guests by dancing and singing Negro spirituals. Well, many of Twain's eccentricities, of course, were affectations, Samuel Clemens' way of publicizing Mark Twain, making him memorable. But like all good dramatic performances, he also always made sure there was an element of truth in them. In some ways, this river boy turned author was, in fact, a true rustic. And he did want to be accepted not only as a writer, but as a man of stature and refinement. And he knew that to effect this transformation, he would need a woman's guidance. Now, the first woman who had tried to civilize Sam Clemens was his mother, since she was the disciplinarian of the household. Later, he met a fellow foreign correspondent named Mary Mason Fairbanks. They became great friends. She was 7 years older than he was, and she took a motherly interest in him. She not only instructed him in matters of etiquette, but she also undertook to give him some lessons in literature as well. She helped him with his writing. But it would be Livy who would eventually assume the composite role of both mother and literary advisor. But in matters of deportment, not even her efforts would have any lasting effect. The fact is that Samuel Clemens never wanted to grow entirely out of his maternally dominated childhood. He enjoyed being instructed in the ways he should better himself. He also enjoyed rehearsing the strong resolve he might show in renouncing some forbidden vice. But he also enjoyed his vices. And so he invariably relapsed, endured his scolding, and promised to reform more completely the next time. And so the process continued throughout their married life. As a popular marriage manual of the time explained the situation, few women understand that at the outset, in marrying a man, they are simply capturing a wild animal, the taming of which is to be the life's work of the woman who has undertaken this charge. Well, certainly when Olivia Langdon married Samuel Clemens in August of 1870, she must have known that she was taking on an unusually exacting responsibility. But she simply could not resist his appeal when he said to her that she was the only woman he had ever met who was capable of saving him from himself. Without her love and good influence, he told her, he would remain forever a homeless vagabond. Meanwhile, to a friend, he wrote at the same time, I will harass that girl and I will harass her until she will have to say yes. Well, of course she did. And after 200 of what later were called the loveliest love letters ever written, she succumbed. In these letters, Clemens told Livy everything she wanted to hear and dared to believe. To begin with, he assured her that he had given up drinking. Of course, he had not, though he later insisted that he personally did not have any objections to abstinence, so long as it did not harm anyone. He also told her that he'd given up smoking, a courageous resolution he made for the first time when he was only 10 years old. It seems that some adults had told him that smoking would perhaps shorten his life by as much as 10 years, and he got scared and he stopped. But then later he thought about it, and he decided that a full decade without smoking would hardly be worth living anyway, and so he resumed smoking with a clear mind. In later years, he would occasionally claim to have given up smoking as an example to others and to prove that he was not a slave to the habit. I can give up smoking whenever I want to, he would say. After all, I have done it 1,000 times. So, quite apart from abandoning any of his favorite habits, he actually enjoyed them more, knowing that they were forbidden and that their indulgence was being policed by his own resident good angel. In fact, within 6 months of their marriage, Clemens had already begun to reinvent his quiet, good natured Livy as a kind of a domestic tyrant, curtailing his every pleasure and ruling their home with an iron hand. He wrote to a family friend, "My wife embodies the practical, the hard, and the unsentimental. She is lord of all she surveys. You ought to see her charge around. When things don't go right, she breaks up the furniture and knocks everything this way and that. When I hear her war whoop, I know it's time to climb out onto the roof." But of course, you know her. And it was precisely because their friends did know Livy that Clemens could get away with such tongue-in-cheek accounts. This private family myth, which turned the gentle Livy into a powerful ruler of the house, served two very practical purposes. First, it allowed Clemens to portray his wife as a far stronger woman than he actually believed her to be. After all, she did have a history of invalidism. And secondly, it relieved his conscience of the guilt he felt leaving so many of the household duties to her so that he could write. And in fact, the duties of a 19th century wife were not inconsiderable. After they settled in Hartford, she quickly realized that as the domestic head of the family, she was expected not only to operate and maintain her own home, but to participate in the social life of the community as well. She had to attend dinner parties, reciprocate invitations, and represent her husband at social functions whenever he happened to be away or lecturing or on business. As the wife of a celebrated writer and the mother of several children, she wrote to her mother and felt sometimes that she was being run to death. Today, she wrote, women must be everything. They must keep up with the current literature. They must know all about art. They must help with one or two benevolent societies. They must be perfect mothers. They must know how to give perfect dinners. They must dress themselves and their children becomingly, and so on, without end. But because she was a woman of her time, she also felt a certain amount of guilt whenever she weighed her own desires and interests against her responsibilities as a wife and a mother, and as a hostess as well. Again, to her mother, she wrote this letter. She says, "This is my work, and I know that I do very wrong when I feel chafed by it. But how can I feel right about it? Sometimes it seems as if the simple sight of people will drive me mad. But of course, I'm wrong. If I could simply accept the fact that this is my work and let things go, I shouldn't be so fretted. But I want so much to do other things, to study, to do things with my children, and I cannot." Happily, she finally found an outlet for her creative energies, which not only challenged her intellectually, but also helped to secure her husband's reputation as one of the leading writers of his time. In 1870, Olivia Langdon Clemens became Mark Twain's official editor. As you heard, Mark Twain had little tolerance for the prejudices and the conceits of middle class America. Even in his earliest writings, he had satirized the church, he had attacked the popular Southern practice of lynching, and skewered many of the most prominent authors of his day, all with just the kind of barbed invective and sarcasm guaranteed to delight intellectuals and to thoroughly alienate the more conservative members of the reading public. So when he received the proof sheets for his first major book, The Innocents Abroad, he asked Livy to read through the book and tell him if there was anything in the book that bothered her or offended her. Well, when he read her notes on the book, he realized at once that he had found his ideal reader and editor. She was intelligent, she was moderately well educated, and she was conventionally religious and a virtual standard bearer of middle class morality. Anything in the books and articles that might offend her would more or less certainly offend the majority of his American reading public. And so for the next 30 years, it was Livy's job to screen all of Mark Twain's writings to either modify or edit out completely anything that was inappropriate. As Clemens himself described the process, it was Livy's job to search out any blast of opinion so strongly worded that they would be more likely to repel than to persuade. True, Clemens did not always heed her advice, and he would often battle with her over a particular word or phrase. Once, when Livy told him that she could not stand the word offal, Offal, and wished he would not use it, he responded, Livy, you are single-handedly bankrupting the English language. Well, years later, he acknowledged her very real contribution to his work and particularly to its popular success. He said, Mrs. Clemens kept a lot of things from getting into print that would have given me a reputation that I wouldn't have cared to have and that I wouldn't have known any better than to have published. Of course, the one book of his that brought them into more conflict than any other was The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Twain had introduced the character of Huckleberry Finn in the earlier Adventures of Tom Sawyer, a book that was clearly intended for younger readers. But when he decided to write a separate book about Tom Sawyer's favorite Confederate in crime, he found himself writing about characters. Sorry, technical difficulties, we used to call them in the golden days. Okay. Well, of all of Mark Twain's books, Huckleberry Finn was the only one that Livy found genuinely alarming. For one thing, for a book about a child, it was extraordinarily violent. As for Huck himself, his language was coarse, and frankly, it was often blasphemous. Clearly, Huck is a juvenile alter ego for the author, a very young Sam Clemens. And the book's portrayal of 19th century America, with its complacent tolerance of racism and bigotry, constituted probably the darkest vision of any book that Mark Twain ever published during his lifetime. But because she clearly understood how important the book was as an expression of Twain's genuine sense of outrage and frustration at the cruelty he saw evidenced in every aspect of American life at that time, she made no attempt to either modify or change the message. There's little point in holding a mirror up to nature if you cover the glass, right? Her only contribution to the book was to question the usage of a few words and to check the accuracy of some of its details. When the book was published in 1885, it was immediately banned from the public library in Concord, Massachusetts, by a library board that characterized the novel as trash, suitable only for the slums. Well, needless to say, Mark Twain was delighted by their decision. He knew enough about publishing to know that a good book banning also meant good business. As he wrote to his nephew, Charles Webster, Dear Charlie, the committee at the Public Library of Concord have given us a rattling good send-off and should guarantee the book will go in several editions. Having expelled Huck Finn from their library, they will sell us an extra 25,000 copies for sure. Well, he was right in principle, but his prediction was far too modest. The fact is that within 2 months of the book's being banned in Concord, it sold over 50,000 copies. Since that time, Huckleberry Finn has remained consistently the most revered and the most reviled single book in American literature. Praised by scholars and other writers from T.S. Eliot to Hemingway, it is universally recognized as one of the world's great novels. But at the same time, it has been consistently censored, banned, bowdlerized, and burned by special interest groups, often representing diametrically opposite positions. Huckleberry Finn has the rare distinction of being the one book equally condemned by the NAACP and the Ku Klux Klan. Right-wing religious groups officially deplore the book as a celebration of parental defiance, while unofficially they resent Twain's insistence that between 1700 and 1860, the most eloquent supporters of slavery were not slave owners or slave traders, but Christian ministers who for 150 years used the Bible to justify and legitimize the practice of slavery. Educators have grumbled at the use of the common and often vulgar language in the book, the language of uneducated people, complete with dialects and backward syntax and casual profanities. And Black groups are disturbed by the school children of today, or disturbed that they should have the school children of today introduced the character of Jim, who is an adult And finally, there are social critics who worry about the strong images that the book depicts about adult hypocrisy and greed and superstition, child abuse, and a culture with an ugly degree of racism in its DNA. But none of Huckleberry Finn's critics have succeeded in raising any doubt whatsoever regarding the book's status as one of the world's great literary masterpieces. It is
Oh, now
without
I hate.
question one of our greatest novels. Ironically, the greatest threat to Huckleberry Finn today is not from traditional censorship boards or that creeping cancer that we call political correctness. This movement might finally succeed in doing what religious zealots and racial bigots have been trying to do for years. Schools and libraries today are removing the book from their shelves, not because they disagree with the message, but simply because of the use of certain 19th century words which were so common and essential at the time. But great novels are not newspapers. They're not meant to reflect the standards of our time, but their own. Mark Twain wrote in the common vernacular of his own time and used with scalpel like precision that one word which no one dares to use today for fear of offending. It is priceless, precisely because Mark Twain held up his mirror to his time that there are moments in Huckleberry Finn that are as searing and unforgettable as the countless photographs that we have today of lynchings of the Old South. Yes, there are images that many people would like to erase from our history, but it's impossible to understand our history without them. And those photographs, those images, and of course, Huckleberry Finn itself is an essential part of that history. Today, it helps to define who we were, hopefully, of course, looking to a future when we will eventually change. Unfortunately, despite his great talent and popularity as a writer, he often found himself in serious financial difficulties, either as a result of poor judgment or simple bad luck. For example, after opening his own publishing company in 1883, he secured the rights to a book, Henry Ward Beecher's autobiography. Now, Beecher was a very popular minister at that time who 10 years earlier had been involved in a nationally publicized scandal. You can imagine the kind of scandals that we're reading about today. Well, Clemens knew that readers would relish a first-hand account of the scandal by the man who was involved in it. And he estimated that he would make as much as $750,000 on this book. So he drew up a contract with Beecher and gave him a check for $5,000 as an advance against royalties. Unfortunately, exactly 3 weeks later, the 73-year-old Beecher dropped dead, costing Clemens not only the $5,000 advance, but almost $100,000 in pre-publication expenses. But his occasional miscalculations in publishing pale beside his disastrous investment in what was called the Page Automatic Typesetter. A former typesetter himself, Sam Clemens knew that publishers all over the world were looking forward to the invention of an automatic typesetter that would make the printing of books easier so that they wouldn't have to hand by hand put letters in a line. Well, several inventors were trying to create the perfect typesetter, and it just so happens that Sam Clemens backed the wrong one. Over a period of 13 years, he invested over $100,000 in a machine that simply never worked. Ironically, about the same time that he was literally pouring money into the Page typesetter, he was offered shares in another new invention for which he could see no immediate use. The agent who tried to interest him in this new invention represented a Mr. Alexander Graham Bell. And the new invention, which Clemens was asked to support, was the telephone. But again, as a result of his lack of vision, he could see no use for it. If you wanted to send a message to somebody, you simply hired a boy and they took it across town for you, or you put it in a letter and mailed it. As a result of losses both in his investments and his publishing house, he was forced to declare bankruptcy in 1895. Now, he could have arranged an agreement which would have allowed him to pay back 50 cents on every dollar, and everybody would have been satisfied. And according to the mores of the time, it would have been a practical thing for a businessman to do. But Livy would not let him do it. His wife said no. And her reasoning was very simple. She said,
A literary man's reputation is his life. He can afford to be money poor, but he cannot afford to be character poor. And so she told her husband, you must earn cent per cent and pay it back. Well, in the end, her advice proved invaluable. For as Mark Twain set forth on a 4-year lecture and reading tour to pay off his debts, audiences greeted him everywhere with flowers, lavish dinners, ovations, and gifts. They knew about his financial problems. He had been very open about them. And they admired not only his willingness to talk about the mistakes that he had made, but also his determination to rectify those mistakes by honoring every single one of his debts in full. No doubt businessmen across America, which all the people they worked with were so scrupulous. In Europe, both Mark and Livy were astonished to realize the extent of his literary reputation. They were not aware that in Berlin, his books were on sale everywhere. In London, many of the most famous writers of the age eagerly sought introductions to this famous and favorite American author. Livy was particularly thrilled to meet so many authors that she had read and loved, like Robert Browning, Lewis Carroll, Anthony Trollope. And she was genuinely moved to learn of the regard in which they held her husband. In Vienna, they were received and entertained by so many members of the royal family that Twain joked that he was now the self-appointed ambassador at large of the United States of America without salary. Well, by the time he returned home, having paid off all of his debts by speaking in virtually every major country and territory on the globe, Samuel Clemens, alias Mark Twain, was one of the best known and most popular writers in the world. But as bright as Mark Twain's professional star was in October of 1900, his private life, of course, was on the verge of shattering. In 1891, during a trip to Europe, Livy had awakened one morning with a headache and a swollen face and neck. The doctors who were called first diagnosed something called erysipelas, but later they found evidence of a hyperthyroid condition which
Work harder and in turn led to high blood pressure, a difficulty in breathing, a chronic fatigue. Her condition in the succeeding decade had worsened. After hosting a tea party one afternoon, she simply collapsed, complaining of rapid heart palpitations. Once again, as they had done when she was a teenager, the doctors recommended isolating her in bed.
pushed a love letter under her door, which she would either answer or not, depending on her strength. In the hope that a warmer climate might be more conducive to her recovery, Clemens took her to Italy, to the Via di Quarta, just outside of Florence, but the move did not help.
Now, Livy had given birth to 4 children. Their son, Langdon, had died just before his 2nd birthday.
And Susie had all grown up to be spirited, healthy, accomplished women, adored by both their parents, of course. But in 1902, Susie developed spinal meningitis and she died just 13 days later, blind and paralyzed. Both Mark and Livy were overcome with grief.
We keep losing.
In her diary, Livy had written, I feel one thing very strongly, and perhaps more and more as the days go by. I feel that our loved ones who go before us escape so much. Well, certainly the devastation that Samuel Clemens felt at Livy's death would last the rest of his life. In an autobiographical manuscript he never completed, Clemens tried to describe Livy in a fictional guise. He wrote, there were no flaws. She was firm and strong. She was as steadfast, as faithful, as trustworthy as the sun, the atmosphere, and the fixed stars. She was fastidiously truthful and cautious and deliberate about making promises. And if she made a promise, she would go to the stake rather than break it. She was loving and she was lovable. And although she did not open her heart to everyone, whoever entered it was its guest forever. But perhaps the most moving tribute he ever paid to his wife, he gave in a little fictional treatment that he created in a little novella called The Diary of Adam and Eve. As Adam stands over his dead wife's grave, feeling hopelessly confused, he muses for a while and then he finally understands the full extent of his loss. And he says, wherever she was, there was Eve. She, of course, was Olivia Langdon Clemens, the woman who almost tamed Mark Twain. Well, of course, he went on to continue writing, not necessarily many things that were published after her death, because frankly, many of them were considered unpublishable. They were so bitter, so harsh. But he continued to speak very often. People loved to hear him speak. And when he turned 70, he was given a very special dinner party. It was actually at DelMonico's restaurant down in New York. And this is the speech that he gave when he was 70 years old. And having just recently turned 70 myself, I identify. Mark Twain said, well, now I am 7. 7. I am old. I recognize it, but I do not realize it. I wonder if a person ever ceases to feel young. I mean, for a whole day at a time. Well, when you get to be 70, actually, I am older than that, but that's old enough. After that, there's simply too much risk. When you get to be that age, you're supposed to sit up and there on that 7 terrace summit and tell the rest of the world how you got up there. They all do it, you know, all those garrulous old people. They explain the process and they dwell on the particulars with senile rapture of how they lived to be so old. Well, I have been anxious to explain my system for some time, and now I have the right. I think I've achieved my 70 years in the usual way by sticking strictly to a scheme of life that would kill anybody else. Now, I have just a few simple rules that I try to follow. I make it a point never to smoke more than 1 cigar at a time. I have no other restrictions. It's true, I have never taken any exercise except sleeping and resting. I could never see the benefit of being tired. And as for diet, I try to be very strict about sticking to things that don't agree with me until one or the other gets the best of me. Well, till recently, I always got the best of it myself, but last spring I did stop frolicking with minced pie after midnight. But the point I want to make is that you can't reach old age by another man's route. My habits protect my life, but they might assassinate you. You have to make up your own rules and then stick to them. Not as easy as it sounds either, because there's bound to be somebody trying to reform you and trying to take all the pleasure right out of your life and replace it with dreariness. But don't you let them. If you can't make it to 70 comfortably, don't go. Tell the truth, I don't believe this reforming sticks very well anyway. I've always clung to my theory that you can straighten a worm out, but the crook is still in him and it's waiting. My dear wife tried diligently for years to get me to give up profanity, and I tried. Never had much success with it. In fact, I've come to believe that there ought to be a room in every house just to swear in. It's dangerous to store up emotion. I could never get over the notion that in certain desperate and trying circumstances, profanity furnishes a relief denied even to prayer. So if I cannot swear in heaven, I shall not stay there. They probably won't let me in anyway. From what my friends tell me, I remember once saying to our pastor, Joe Twitchell, that I planned to be cremated. He just looked at me and said, oh, I wouldn't worry about that, knowing your chances. Well, I would like to see my old ancestor Satan one of these days. I have no special regard for him, but I can at least claim that I have no prejudice against him. It may even be that I lean a little his way on account of his not having ever been given a fair show. All religious issue Bibles against him and say the most injurious things about him, but we never hear his side of the story. We have only the evidence of the prosecution, and yet we have rendered a verdict. To my mind, this is irregular. It is un-English. It is worse than that. It is un-American. It's French. Of course, Satan has some case, but that goes without saying. It may be a poor one, but that can be said of us all. As soon as I can get to the facts, I intend to undertake his rehabilitation myself if I can find an unpolitic publisher. We may not pay him reverence, but we can at least respect his talents. A person who has, for untold centuries, maintained the imposing position of spiritual head of 4/5 of the human race and the political head of the whole of it must have executive abilities of the loftiest order. So I would like to meet him. I would rather like to see him and shake him by the tail than any other statesman that I know. And of course, I probably will. Well, maybe it won't be so bad down there. When I think of the number of disagreeable people I know who have publicized the fact that they're going to the other place, I am sure that it won't be that bad at all. I always remember the poor fellow who tried diligently all his life to achieve heaven, and when he finally got there, the first person he met was a fellow he had been hoping all that time was in hell. He was so disappointed, and he was so outraged that he inquired the way to hell, packed up his satchel, and he left. So there you have it. Heaven for the climate, hell for the country.